Hello and welcome. Thank you for joining us today. I am Ann Cuss, WMF's Regional Director of North America, and I'll be your host today for this On My Watch event. Today's event is part of a series of conversations inviting architects, urban planners, preservationists, local stakeholders, and WMF project managers to explore the political, cultural, and technical issues around preservation of cultural heritage sites at risk included on our World Monuments Watch. Now, the subject of today's event is Bears Ears. Bears Ears was placed on the 2020 WMF Watch to highlight the challenges of increased recreational visitation and protections needed to safeguard the many places within the monument. Now, the region hosts over 500,000 visitors from around the world each year and received its national monument status in 2016 after more than a century of efforts to protect the unique landscape spread out over 1.3 million acres. Now, the boundaries are subject of a highly contested and ongoing legal battle centered around the shrinking of the original designation. Reducing the boundaries has unchecked disastrous effects for the sensitive landscapes and ecosystems of the land at Bears Ears. But fortunately, the Biden administration decided to uphold the original proposed boundaries in October of last year, operating on the principle that public lands need to be protected for all time and for all people. Now, I hope the video you just saw gave you a sense of the magnitude and complexity of Bears Ears. It's such a rich living landscape, home to thousands of sites and sacred to the many indigenous peoples who not only rely on the land for traditional uses, but also for their very existence. We are grateful to the Ancient Art Archive for some of the incredible footage that you've just seen. A big thanks to them for helping us out with today's event. Now, you can see more of their work to preserve sensitive rock imagery and art throughout the world at ancientartarchive.org. And we'll put a link in the chat because you're definitely gonna want to check that out. This event is hosted in partnership with the New York chapters of the American Institute of Architects and has been approved for AIA learning units. Please look at the link in our chat and you can see how you can receive credit for today's event. Speaking of the chat, if you have any questions during our discussion, please feel free to post them or in the Q&A box as they come to you. And we will try our very, very best to get through all the questions at the end of our conversation. But before we jump in, let's take a moment and say hello and introduce our speakers. Joining us today, we have Brandy Hurt from the Bears Ears Intertribal Coalition. Now, Brandy is the intertribal liaison and traditional knowledge advocate. The coalition represents a historic consortium of sovereign tribal nations from Hopi Tribe, Navajo or Ute Nation, the Ute Mountain Ute Tribe, Pueblo of Zuni, and Ute Indian Tribe. We are honored to have Brandy here to discuss their ever ongoing work safeguarding the sacred ancestral landscape that is Bears Ears. And I know I'm just so excited to talk about this stuff. Let me slow it down for everybody. So next up, we have Joe Newhoff. Joe is the executive director of Friends of Cedar Mesa. Friends of Cedar Mesa has been WMF's partner for the hands-on boots in the ground work throughout the landscape and the 2020 watch cycle. We're so glad that you could join us today, Joe. And last but not least, we have Kevin Cuyate, a member of Pueblo of Zuni and Ancestral Lands Conservation Corps Zuni Pueblo manager. Have some fans out there, Kevin. The Ancestral Lands Conservation Corps' vision is to lead Indigenous nations back to ecological and cultural well-being by engaging underrepresented Indigenous youth and young adults in conservation service programs. Thanks for coming, everybody. And thank you so much for making the time today. Now, we only have an hour to get through so much material, so I think we're just going to jump right in. So Brandy, I would really like to open up the floor to you first. You know, sometimes when we hear and we talk about tribal lands, it's talked about in this singular kind of monolith, and the land within the national monument means so much to so many different people. So I was wondering, can you discuss some of the unique tribal perspectives about the land at Bears Ears and just how important these perspectives are when it comes to, you know, collaborating with our non-tribal preservation partners?
Sure, Anne, thanks for having me. I'm honored to be here. I wish the tribal leaders could be here to speak for themselves. Internet connection is a bit unreliable back home. I'm honored to serve the leaders in this space. And because I lack the authority to speak on a lot of things, I want to be really thoughtful here. Bears Ears is a part of traditional history, and each tribe connects to the place in their own special way. The Hopi Tribe sees their relationship to Bears Ears as a covenant. When Hopi entered into the fourth world, they made a pact with the Earth Guardian, who gave them use of the land as long as they would act as environmental stewards and remember their religious and traditional connections to the earth. The Guardian told Hopi to migrate as clans across the land until they reached their destinations at the Hopi Mesas. On their travels, each clan gained special knowledge and ties to certain areas and features. They intentionally left behind evidence, the sites, the artifacts, the rock writing, as payment to the earth and to remember their commitment. Hopi have an obligation to revisit ancestral places in Bears Ears, to preserve these ties and fulfill this covenant. There are many Hopi clans with specific ties to Bears Ears, but the place is important to all Hopi people. For Dene, or Navajo people, Bears Ears is a place of healing. It's a place of refuge. It's a place of ceremony. They go there to hunt, to gather plants, to make offerings and pray, and to renew resources. They have names for places in Bears Ears, and these names appear in ceremonies. Traditional herbalists go there to gather plants for use in ceremonies and for healing. They gather piña nuts for food. When enemies pressed Navajo people too hard, they would retreat deep into Bears Ears to what they call the escaping place. Navajo families that live near Bears Ears today have always maintained their connections. It's a part of their cultural universe. Many clans originated on the landscape, so it's tied to their family histories, to their identity. The sight of Bears Ears alone makes people think about connection and ceremony. Navajo people can't imagine themselves separate from Bears Ears. For Ute people, they have always been on the Bears Ears landscape. There are many place names and there are lots of Ute stories. Bears Ears is the place where bear first emerges from hibernation in the spring, and it's important for the bear dance. Ute consider bear a relative. There are places on the land that hold sacred power that only spiritual leaders know how to use. Rivers defined Ute territories, and there are lots of Ute trails. People moved across the landscape seasonally to use different resources at different times of the year. And this constant movement tied Ute people to the natural world. So access to land and resources is absolutely fundamental to Ute identity and traditions. For Ashui, Zuni, place is more than just a physical location. A sense of place is what makes us human. Zuni lived and traveled through Bears Ears on their way to the middle place, and it's especially important to medicine societies. Zuni have a deep association with land and place. And this is expressed in their songs and their prayers and in storytelling. And the retelling of stories creates a sense of belonging. It binds people to a place. For example, rock writing can contain a lot of information. And for Zunis, it's a way for ancestors to commune with the present. When Zuni elders go to these places, when they decipher the messages and reactivate that knowledge, the past and present come together. Meaning is tied to a specific location, so Zuni have to go there. Revisiting ancestral places and reactivating knowledge is a way for Zuni to continue today. Each tribe connects to Bears Ears in their own special way, and they all have unique obligations. These perspectives give the land life and purpose beyond just resources to be used. I think it's important for people to understand that Bears Ears is a fundamental part of who tribes are, and that land stewardship is a way to fulfill religious and traditional obligations. So conservation and preservation are always personal. I think Indigenous people are changing the way we think about place. If we can consider the land as a whole, if we can consider more holistic management strategies, and if we can recognize that people and place share a symbiotic partnership and that we aren't separate, I think we can improve the way we interact with our public lands and probably each other. Thanks, Anne.
Oh, thank you so much for that, Brandy. And thank you to the coalition for sharing these unique perspectives. It's always great to hear about some of the mindsets and perspectives from the original stewards, and I think we need more of that. So, to bring it back with how we relate to the land and how we interact, I think I would be remiss archaeologist if I didn't ask, what should our visitors do when they come across any type of cultural resource, including archaeological artifacts, when they're on the land within the monument, and why?
Sure. I would say, and I think the leaders would say, appreciate, admire, but leave in place. A Zuni elder I work with, Mr. Octavius Seotowa, I think said it best. He said, when a potter makes a pot, he leaves behind his sweat, his fingerprints, his DNA, his intention. He essentially becomes a part of it. So when you take an artifact, you're taking the maker from his home. Thank you.
Couldn't have said that better myself, and thank you for sharing that story. It's good. The more we know and the more we can understand why we need to be respectful when we're visiting public lands, and especially tribal lands. It's always great. But I think it's a good point to build on that and talk about respect and bring Joe into the conversation. So, I mentioned earlier when we started that Friends of Cedar Mesa has partnered with WMF since the watch listing. And one of the biggest undertakings has been to add educational materials at places to kind of re-guide visitor traffic and lessen the stress of some of our sites. So Joe, could you tell us more about FCM's Visit with Respect program and some of the steps that we've taken during this project to implement these good stewardship practices?
Sure, thanks, Anne, and thanks everyone for joining us today. A big thanks for Brandy for that first piece. I'm the executive director of Friends of Cedar Mesa. We work to build respect and protect the greater Bears Ears region. We're based in Bluff, Utah, small little community on the edge of the monument, and we have a growing staff of professionals that are out working every day to engage the public, do projects on the land, and work with the tribes and their interests in this greater Bears Ears region. So one of the things, as Anne noted earlier, is we've seen a massive increase in visitation to this area. Even before the monument was designated, but certainly after the monument was designated, this area has just exploded in folks curious and interested in learning why this place is so sacred, so special, wanting to experience the beauty and awe of Bears Ears. And so, literally hundreds of thousands of more visitors since 2015, 2016. So with that said, one of our core campaigns is surrounds making sure, ooh, hold on a second, everybody. My laptop just said low battery and I thought it was plugged in. Give me one quick second. Okay. So we started the Visit with Respect program, and really the goal of the program is to be able to educate all those folks that are coming here. And so there's a couple ways that we do that. We have ambassadors on the ground interacting with folks that are visiting. There's there's several points to which many of the folks that visit sort of funnel into this area. And so we concentrate on those spots so that we can interact with the most number of folks possible to be able to, through signage, through ambassadors, to be able to educate them on how to visit with respect in this ancestral cultural landscape. And so, I mean, just a couple things that I'd mention. Brandy mentioned this, but leave all artifacts in place. Viewing sites from a distance is a really important piece. We don't have to go into sites. It's very respectful to keep your voice down, to visit in a way where you're understanding that these places are important and they're sacred. You know, if you have dogs, that's a big issue out here. People like to bring their dogs for obvious reasons. You know, we don't need dogs digging in these sites, staying on designated roads, not touching rock imagery. It's just a few examples of some of the things that we think about. Many folks probably know about Leave No Trace. There's been a lot of work around the country to educate recreationists about Leave No Trace. Well, this goes a little further than Leave No Trace, because oftentimes those principles, while good, don't include visiting ancestral sites, cultural sites. So with that, I would just move on and highlight some of the work that we're doing, and then some of what we're seeing on the ground as far as impacts. So we work with Ancestral Lands Corps. We collaborate with the Bears Ears Intertribal Coalition, Brandy, and the different coalition tribes that when we initiate any type of activity on the monument. And so it's really profound work with support from WMF to be out there, you know, with Indigenous young adults and teenagers that are connecting with these sites. They're helping us to make sure that any impacts to these sites are being mitigated. Some of those impacts are from visitors. Some of those impacts are from erosion and natural processes, and others. So that tribal engagement piece, working with the tribes, working with Ancestral Lands Corps, which we're going to hear more about from Kevin in a minute, to do that work on the ground in the monument is so important. And because, you know, what we're seeing, especially in the last couple of years with the increase in visitation, you know, there's graffiti. Folks have never, and sometimes I think it's a lack of education. I don't know if there's an intention to harm. There's folks that come, they've never been in a place like this. They see other graffiti or other marks on the landscape. And it's sort of as the broken window effect to a certain degree. So it's important to work to mitigate these impacts, to remove graffiti, to educate people not to, you know, bump into walls, not to you know, cause more harm than they intentionally would otherwise. So we also do see looting. We still folks do come to sites to collect sacred artifacts, and they you know, sometimes that's for personal collections or for profit. Sometimes it's just due to lack of education and not knowing that it's inappropriate to take something. So again, our Visit with Respect program is working to educate folks. We have a education center in Bluff, the only sort of visitor center for the monument at this point, and it's really geared towards engaging visitors, educating them how to visit respectfully, educating them about the history and the connection to the tribes. So.
Yeah, thank you, Joe. You know, a lot of the work
Sure.
that FCM and WMF that we do out there focuses on communicating just everything that you're talking about through the signs, through the educational materials, through interpretive stories from our tribal partners. And, you know, we talked a little bit about some of the big graffiti and looting and that kind of thing, but can we just take a minute to talk more about some of the wear and tear, you know, the whole concept of being loved to death, and how some just things that we do, walking, just being in the site, what kind of common damage comes with that, and how we can better that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, we do see just through visitation, some of these sites, some of these backcountry sites are, they're seldom seen and they get very few visitors. I mean, that doesn't mean that one really destructive visit can't do a lot of damage, but in the more front country accessible sites, those sites where the GPS points have been put on the internet and in guidebooks for people to visit, really before the BLM and other management agencies have had a chance, and the tribes have had a chance to determine what's appropriate and what's not for visitation. These places that are close to the road, easy to get a lot of visitation. And, we often see a spider web of trails going up to many of these sites. Folks don't realize that when they go off trail up to a site, they may be walking on an important cultural resource. They might be walking really on a key part of what makes this an important site, both to the tribes and for for the management agencies and others. And so, unless you've really spent time learning more about these places and the cultural landscape around them, you really don't have a sense of what the impacts are. I mean, even, multiple cars driving up, people leaving their trash, if it's a place near the road, like I said, braided trails. And these sites really weren't built for thousands of people every year, even hundreds of people to crawl through them in the way that they're crawling through them at the moment. And I think it just feels really inappropriate to me when I see the types of impacts that we're seeing on the ground. And we just need to work to educate people. We need to work with the land management agencies, maybe to have ways to limit the number of people that are going to really sensitive sites. And so, we're working on all of those visitor management strategies with both the tribes and the BLM, and trying to come up with solutions, but it's hard. In the era of the internet, in the era of this information just being out there and all the folks interested in this place, the solutions are hard ones, and they're long term. So.
Yeah, thank you for that, Joe. And just I know we're in the space and we're used to the federal alphabet soup, but just for our international crowd, yeah, the BLM would be the Bureau of Land Management, which is one of many public federal agencies here in the United States. But you bring up a lot of good points. It is a tricky dance that we do, wanting to experience these places, but also respect and protect them. And thanks for just kind of educating us just about how some of the things, even walking, like, one walk, but thousands can have quite the impact as looting or as graffiti or as some kind of other malicious, activity. But on speaking about damage, I think this is a good point to bring Kevin into the conversation and learn about how we mitigate or how we repair or rehabilitate some of these sites in sensitive areas. So, Kevin, just for those unfamiliar, and full disclosure, coming from a conservation corps service background myself, for those unfamiliar, can you just give us a crash course on the Conservation Corps model, and what types of experiences does the Ancestral Lands Corps wish to generate through this type of crew?
Yes, before I elaborate on the answer, if I may introduce myself in my language, but Keshe don teona na te kat don lagi te na help Kevin Kuya to let you know no tio yato kya ko te an toa ko awon chatla. And hello everyone. As mentioned, my name is Kevin Kuyaiti. My traditional clans are son and child of a corn, and it is within that sense of an introduction that I'm honored to present, not only represent myself, my community, but also the group I'm affiliated with, which is the Ancestral Lands Conservation Corps. As you can see depicted, it's a group photo consisting of various leaders and crew members represented from many indigenous backgrounds and communities, including but not limited to the Pueblo of Zuni, parts of the Navajo Nation, Hopi, the Hopi Tribe, various community members represented from the Albuquerque locations, and of course the Acoma Pueblo being represented here. But really, it's been a conservation corps built upon from our sisters over at the Southwest Conservation Corps and the bigger organization Conservation Legacy. But it's given us, I feel and truly believe that it's given us a chance and more or less the voice and the empowerment to go about conservation projects such as trail building, river restoration, and tying into our discussion in historic preservation. Depicted right there right now is an example of a before shot. When we walk up to a scene, a lot of our historic preservation crews will assess the scene for its damage, whether it's from rodent deterioration, vegetation, some of those uncontrollables, as well as the bigger impact from visitors. And as was mentioned from Brandy and Joe, there can be a lot of negative impact, and perhaps even perhaps some of it may be unintentional. I know for a fact when I do come across the site, my excitement is going up the roof, and I want to get to a certain location, and I may not really understand that there's a designated trail to go about. So a lot of our conservation, or a lot of our core crews are definitely dedicated to a lot of our many projects, especially restoring cultural sites such as the sites located in Bears Ears. And here depicted now is the aftershot. And the goal is to keep the aesthetics as appropriately as possible. But in doing so, we're not only connecting our youthful participants to technicals such as masonry work or even tuck pointing and repointing, but as was mentioned earlier, we're also reconnecting, perhaps not only physically but spiritually, to a lot of these sites. And it is within that sense that a lot of our participants are truly impacted spiritually. One of those impactful moments is that of ancestral work, so to speak. Back then when there were minimal inventions, or rather the conventions of machinery. Everything was done by hands-on. So you can see depicted this crew taking buckets of sand up to the site called River House. And this was their daily routine. They would wake up early, as early as 5 a.m., cook breakfast for each other, do a stretch and safety circle, and get back and get on to their project site. This group, which happens to be a Zuni crew, led by Darren Bukwa and Matthew Kuyati, they took pride every day, although it may be backbreaking work, excruciating, laborious work. They often reminded themselves of what our ancestors did to build those structures in the first place. And so with that, it built endurance, it built strength, it built a deeper perspective of what has been established as far as our ancestral lineage. And continuing on, the pride is showcased in encouraging each and every one of us in our spaces to truly identify who they feel themselves to be. As I mentioned, a lot of the Zuni crews take pride in a lot of the locations and sites and projects we've definitely dabbled with. Here depicted is a crew who was on the season last year. So it's led by Kendrick Nahohai and Calton Tucson. But they took it upon themselves to wear this traditional regalia in the form of a headscarf, as well as a slash or a cornmeal pouch. I saw a couple of the folks are also bearing turquoise necklaces. They took it upon themselves, as I mentioned, not only to symbolize who and identify themselves of being Ashui, but also in the sense of respect. So perhaps the spiritual energy may not sense the physical, characteristics, but again, through the spiritual connection and respect. This is one way a crew has definitely offered some offerings to these sites. And not only have our crews been impacted, but more so our project partners, the visitors, as well as our community members. They're just as impacted from an experience of work, getting to work on these sites as much as the participants and myself are. Depicted is the group picture of the crew you saw previously in the slide. Also, they're sharing space with the ZCRAT team, or Zuni Cultural Resource Advisory Team. But yeah, a part of that team is Octavia Sialtua, Gilbert Usilu, and Alex or Demetrius Sialtua. But their representative, community representatives, either holding religious leader roles, or they hold some significant cultural knowledge. But this is a moment, and they're gathered in the spring, and one of those significant resources is that of water, which is a powerful and energetic resource. But they took the time to take this group photo after having shared sharing a meal, after sharing an excruciating hike, after sharing laughs, after sharing stories. But again, they did so not only for themselves in the physical connection, but also to offer that spiritual connection going forward. And to me, a lot of what we do in the Ancestral Lands Conservation Corps is really to empower young folks to reconnect or find ways to identify who they truly are from their ancestral background, if that's what they so choose. But it's really leading our nations back to cultural and ecological well-being as best as possible with the many projects we have on hand. Well, thank you for your time.
Thank you, Kevin. I just wanted to ask one little follow-up question before we kind of get back to the group chat, but just to kind of reiterate to everyone, Ancestral Lands, this is an identity-based crew. And, I know that there's this narrative and this kind of trope in the world at large that Indigenous youth don't care. There aren't these opportunities to get them connected and get them out on the land and so they can experience and all of that comes with it. So can you just really briefly, just a couple of minutes, can you talk to a little bit more about what that means to the Indigenous youth? What are you hearing? What is, you talked a bit about the camaraderie and the connection, but what does it really mean to the youth in the Bears Ears area?
Well, and before I continue on, I can only speak on the perspective from the participants here in the Zuni office, and definitely each and every one of our representatives in the Ancestral Lands staff have their own unique perspectives. But coming from the Zuni office, really it's not only is it a chance to reconnect, but a majority of our participants, for them to join the program, this is for some, this is their very first job-like experience. This is their very first time going outside of our village. And so for them to have this opportunity to go outside of their village, let's just keep that in mind for a second. They're going from having to know the background of the village, both physically, culturally, what have you, to all of a sudden gaining an experience in Bears Ears, where they're seeing structures built by the ancestors. And so for someone to not only feel a sense of nervousness, to feel perhaps even a sense of fear for embarking on something brand new, such as going on a job for the first time, they get to walk up on a site like River House or Lewis Lodge, and they're just impacted. First and foremost, the reaction they get is speechless. I know I was speechless when I first walked upon the site at River House. And then my curiosity started going, wondering where they got those resources, but also reconnecting to what I know now in either masonry or the traditional aspects of why a home was built, whether it was for food storage, whether it was for cultural, religious significance, what have you. But for one person to start the journey on the Ancestral Lands Corps, then all of a sudden have the opportunity to work on the site, that's very impactful, and honestly, really words cannot describe until we get a moment to really reflect on that time.
Yeah, I mean, it's such important work that you're doing out there, and our Corps members, they really are the unsung heroes of the national service world, at least here in the United States, and we rely on them so much to care and to train and to really do the kind of big peat preservation work. And I absolutely love hearing this and seeing this. So thank you so much for your perspectives and sharing about the work that you're doing. I wanted to open it up and pose this. We're discussing thousands and thousands and thousands of years of history when it comes to this area and Bears Ears in the land. An hour really doesn't, really 40 minutes doesn't really begin to scratch the surface. So I wanted to pose this question to the group. how do we learn about this stuff? What are the best resources for people who want to dive deeper and learn about the history of the land from these non-dominant, that is, Western perspectives that we've been hearing, or the opposite of that we've been hearing today?
I guess I can begin. The coalition tribes have been working for the past 2.5 years on a land management plan for Bears Ears from their perspective. And if that's made available to the public, I imagine that would be a valuable resource to folks. Also, each tribe has their own libraries and archives. So you can always reach out to a tribe's cultural or heritage department for more information. And then finally, I look to Indigenous scholars for more perspective. There are lots of folks out there and they're doing really good work. Folks like Lau Balenqua, Rena Martin, Regina Lopez White Skunk, and Jim Enote are a few folks that come to mind. Thanks.
Thank you, Brandy. What about Joe? Do you have any resources that you can pass along?
Yeah, a big resource is bearsearsmonument.org is a website that we set up that has all of the visit with respect principles, has some recreation information and maps. It has some resources just on visiting the monument, how to visit the monument respectfully. If anyone on this call is thinking of coming or bringing a group, I would echo everything Brandy said as far as the background and the significance, but as far as the sort of the guide to how to practically visit and not do damage, I would check out bearsearsmonument.org.
Okay, great. And Kevin, do you have any information? I mean, you've given us so much today, but where is it all contained, and how do we get it and access it?
Definitely, we do. As Brandy was noting, we do hold some information here locally with our Ashuawa Museum. So you can check out the Ashuawa Museum website. I'll be sure to drop a link here on the chat. But aside from that, if those you visiting Bears Ears happen to cross paths with one of our crews, that's one of the most resourceful ways to gain that education through that sheer perspective of those working on those dwellings.
Great, thank you. I think now is a good time to take some questions that we're seeing, and we have so many great questions. And again, I wish that we could just sit here all day and answer them. Nothing would make me happier, but we have time constraints to worry about. I wanted to bring this up again to the group because it came up really early in the chat, and it's an important aspect of working in cultural heritage, especially on sacred and ancestral lands. But the question was asked is, why is GPS harmful? And I know, Joe, you kind of touched on that, but I think that's worth discussing.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I have a very basic answer to that, and that is that what we're seeing is, a GPS unit within itself is not harmful, but a GPS coordinates to cultural sites that are either shared word of mouth or shared on the internet or posted in other places. There's no way to control that. There's no way to be respectful around that. I mean, once it gets, I should say, a better way to say that is once those GPS coordinates get out into the world, there's no way to bring them back. And that's how a lot of people are getting out and deeper into Bears Ears. And sometimes folks that haven't reviewed the visit with respect principles or done any research on how to visit this landscape appropriately. So that would be my answer.
Yep, and that's a great answer. Brandy or Kevin, is there anything else you'd like to add about coordinates and how we can respect and kind of visit from a distance like we've been talking about?
Kevin, if you don't mind, I don't really have anything to add specifically on coordinates and GPS, but do understand from tribes' perspective, many of these places hold power. And so visiting places is not something to be taken lightly. Indigenous people visit these places for a number of reasons, but understand that it can impact your life. And I think tribes would appreciate folks looking at the landscape beyond just resources to be used or places to be consumed, and to treat the land as a family, and to recognize what happens to the land happens to us all. So thank you.
Yes, to share some note on that. Thank you to you both, Brandy and Joe. And as to elaborate on what Brandy was mentioning, as far as significant sites, there is actually knowledge that's not readily shared even to every community member, and respectfully so. There's certain groups, specific religious groups that tend to want to hold their places, in sacredness. And so with those where those GPS and those coordinates coming to mind, those geolocations, really they broadcast perhaps even sacred shrines, sacred springs, should only be accessible to a certain amount, because they hold a spiritual respect. And that's a lot of what we believe in that we not only create physical impacts but spiritual impacts as well. So to protect not only those in that area, or perhaps future or past entities, just being mindful of those sacred sites can be enough education.
All right, thank you so much. And I know, just to kind of sidestep here, I know that we're getting some questions in the chat about the status of the Bears Ears Monument and how whatever goes into, if it's going to be reversed. And as I did mention in the introduction, this is an ongoing court case, and that's a little too close to all of us, and none of us are lawyers, and we are not trying to sidestep that, but we don't feel it's appropriate as information that's shared may be used against people in a court of law. So we're going to sidestep that one and move on. So I saw a question about cryptobiotic soils in the chat, and the question is, could we talk about cryptobiotic soils? Good to see the archaeologists on the call. Thanks very much. And for those who are unaware, when we talk about cryptobiotic soil crusts, we're really talking about it's a living organism such as algae or bacteria or fungus, and how that hardens up and forms a crust in these organisms and in this soil matter. So this crust is really important and it means a lot as far as erosion, arid soils. It plays into the water table. So I'm going to pose this one to you, Brandy, because this one feels super appropriate. With that explanation, just can we generally talk about, some of the soil science very generally, as to not have people's eyes glaze over on the call, and what that means as far as the ecology and the balance that we need in the land?
Sure. I think it's probably most appropriate because I serve tribes in a different space. So I don't work as an archaeologist for tribes. And because leaders aren't here to advocate and speak for themselves, I think it's important to really prioritize their perspectives, and that might not be rooted in archaeology. So I would say, I guess I see soils and soil management really as part of maybe an effort and a point of collaboration, potential collaboration around climate change and promoting climate resiliency. I think that's a huge interest for all coalition tribes and all tribes with connection to Bears Ears. So, and I've also heard Hopi and Zuni express a lot of interest in soil management projects and preservation projects, and even springs restoration projects. So I think I'd like to leave it at that. That would be a priority and a high value for our coalition tribes, and a potential point for collaboration. But when it comes to archaeology, maybe I'll turn that over to Joe, and maybe you guys can talk a little bit about how to visit the landscape without making significant impacts to ensure this precious desert landscape is preserved while visitors are visiting.
Yeah, thanks, Brandy. And I would actually echo something you said earlier. And I've heard, when I've been out on the land, with tribal representatives, which is the most impactful part of my work personally. And I'm always humbled and inspired to be out there. But, the soil crust and all the living landscape is part of the cultural resource. It's part of the cultural, it's the whole thing is important. And I think it's an important point, just to echo, as you sort of said earlier, Brandy, that all of these things aren't in their own silos and test tubes when you approach a site. The whole place, all the soil crusts, all the the rock material, all of the different maybe a dwelling or a granary or whatever it may be, it all fits into this entire experience, and it's all significant, both from a tribal perspective, from what I've heard, but I think also from a recreation perspective too. This whole landscape fits together. So if you step on the soil crust, then you've taken away not just the ability for that soil to stay in place and that ecology to function. You've also taken away from the, part of what gives that place meaning and part of what gives that place beauty too. And so on the crust issue, I would just leave it at that. And again, it's kind of silly to keep parroting it, but I think bearsearsmonument.org, it has all of the visit with respect principles. It has a lot of information on how you can visit in a way that's not impactful. So I would, instead of taking up too much time, I would just urge folks to go there and check that out. And let us know if it's missing anything or if you have any questions.
Great. I would love to spend all day talking about cryptobiotic soils and how they play into salinity and water and all types of things. But let's bring it back to a bigger, broader question that is always on our minds. And really that is, how can we work together in the many parts that encompass, preservation with the big P? And that takes all kinds. It takes archaeologists, it takes cultural heritage managers and specialists, it takes local community stakeholders, tourism. Preservation is more than just an old building or place is damaged, and we need to address the material. When I say material, I mean the mortar, the brick, the dry stack, all of that kind of stuff, that the aesthetic and physical properties. Preservation is an interdisciplinary grassroots effort. So having said that, how can preservationists, how can we all develop truly collaborative, that is collective efforts to incorporate Indigenous-informed strategies of stewardship, proven, methods that have been working for millennia? Let's open that up to the group.
I guess I'll go first. Kevin, I wish you would have taken this one. I think, again, areas for collaboration would be providing opportunities for youth and elder to do programs and projects together, to provide opportunities for youth to make meaningful impacts on the landscape, much like what Ancestral Lands is doing, and provide opportunities for elders to share their experience and knowledge with their children, to cultivate the next generation of Indigenous experts. Again, I'd also encourage folks to consider conservation projects and efforts beyond just those that deal with archaeological resources. Cultural resources and natural resources, as Joe was discussing, aren't separate categories in Native life. All elements are cultural, and so all of the environment kind of exists in a sacred interrelation and unity, and you can't consider spaces and resources separate from the landscape as a whole. So I think tribes would encourage managers to think more holistically and conscientiously about the work that they're doing. And that work should be rooted in conservation and preservation based on stewardship and reciprocity. These are the fundamental aspects of traditional knowledge. Someone else?
I
Thanks for
can
being
chime in a
brave,
bit.
Brandy. Sorry, Kevin.
Yeah, no, that's all right. I can chime in a bit, and that's one of my biggest appreciations is that of perspective, Brandy. So I knew you have extensive amount of knowledge on your behalf, and I thank you for sharing that. Plus, also holding space for myself to elaborate a bit more on my perspective to this question. I feel like we're doing it as we speak, bringing awareness, continuing to find those sources of education, not only for those that we're presenting for, but even for, especially for ourselves. First and foremost, learn for ourselves before we start educating continuously. That's what I've been learning throughout my many roles as a core member, crew leader, field supervisor, coordinator, and now program manager, is obtaining and understanding that information, and therefore being confident enough to share that information continuously. And to go back to the question of how can we continue to do so, is just this: bringing awareness, but also providing opportunities for conservation crews like the program I'm affiliated with to have that opportunity to either not only learn the technicals, but to find some sort of means to reconnect. And so that's what I feel the Ancestral Lands Conservation Corps has been doing thus far, is finding those individuals, those dedicated community members, and educating them from our experiences to uphold, either their traditional traditions, whether it's language, activities, events, or even just empowering them to go outside of their village, as I shared with the group earlier today, to go outside of their villages and explore the rest of the land, because without that continued awareness, without that continued advocacy, we're still going to be continue to be overlooked. We're not going to give that chance, or we're not going to get the opportunity to really show folks, but really show ourselves of our capabilities.
That's so great. And in the interest of balance and fairness, I do want to kind of talk about, and I think this is a question for Joe and Kevin, Bernie as well. But so when we're talking about, the physical conservation, can you talk about some of the traditional methods that we're using, and then what are some of the goals? Is it restoration? Is it recreation? Is it rehabilitation? All the big R's for all the preservation people out there. So can we discuss some of the physical impacts that we're having?
Sure, I'm happy to start and then turn it over to Kevin. So it's a really good question, Anne, and it's something that we more and more, we very much give deference to our tribal partners, and we learn so much from our tribal partners on how we should be interacting with these sites that are at risk, that I think from my sort of background would need some help or need some protection. But I've learned very quickly working here that sometimes that's not the case, or the right way to think about it. There are opinions that I've heard within our conversations with our tribal partners that sometimes these sites are meant to be ephemeral. There's a life cycle and a process that's supposed to happen. And then other times I've heard a perspective that we should really harden a site and have a lot of interpretation, so that folks that come can learn all about how to visit with respect, or have a few spots that can really handle the volume of visitation, and that's appropriate and that's okay. And so I think my answer and non-answer to your question, I think, is that I think we're just doing the best we can to mitigate impacts on sites, whether that's from natural processes or human-caused impacts, and we're trying to do that as appropriate, in collaboration with what we learned from engaging our tribal partners on the land. on their ancestral sites. So it really is a wide-ranging mix of approaches and mindset, and we try to do it with a lot of respect, and we always learn something when we're out. So
great. And Kevin, did you want to kind of wrap it up? I know we're almost at time here.
Yeah, sure. And yeah, to extend on what Joe was mentioning, it does take a whole spectrum to really figure out what a certain site would need, and about more so what we do in the projects we involve ourselves with is to as Joe mentioned, to mitigate any further erosion and any further damage, whether it's from rodents, vegetation, visitors, but also just to maintain the aesthetics. I've heard a participant mention that they're taking care of grandma's home, so to speak, and that's part of that spiritual connection I was mentioning earlier. But furthermore, it's yeah, just finding those again those opportunities to educate ourselves, but bringing in awareness, but also just being open and humble to what may come as far as these potential challenges. But as I said, together we can definitely bring that continued awareness.
Thank you so much. And unfortunately, we're almost at time here. So I just wanted, real briefly, to open it up. Do we have any last imparting thoughts before we close this out for the day from our speakers?
I would just like to take this opportunity to thank the tribal leaders, cultural advisors, elders who all made Bears Ears National Monument a reality. It's through your hard work that we have promised protection for the sacred lands for everyone to respect and enjoy. So thank you. And thank you to our friends and partners, Friends of Cedar Mesa and Ancestral Lands, for safeguarding the landscape when no one else would. Thank you.
yeah, and I'd echo what Brandy just said, and just add a thanks to World Monuments Fund for being such an important, critical partner and supporter and funder for so much of this work over the past several years. So thank you.
Thank you very much for this time, this opportunity. One thing I felt connected to was with y'all, but more so knowing that we're all on this land together, whether it's here in the U.S. or globally. We're all on walking on some sort of land which is connected us. So thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you all so much. I wish we could just do this all day, but I think that's gonna wrap up our event. Thank you again to all of our supporters who were able to join us today. And I would like to thank our event partners, the Ancient Art Archive and the New York and UK chapters of the American Institute of Architects. I'd also like to thank Butler Conservation and the Mancow Fund for their support of WMF's work at Bears Ears. Finally, deepest thanks to all of our wonderful speakers for taking the time to share their knowledge with us and collaborating with WMF for this event. Really, thank you. This was such a great talk. I'm so happy to and honored to be a part of this. Once again, make sure to take a look in the chat for the link to sign up for those AIA credits. You'll also find a link in there to a short survey, and we'd love to hear from all of you and learn more about your experiences with our WMF programs. I hope you'll join us for our next events. Visit our website, wmf.org, for details. We have a terrific event coming up from London, live streaming for virtual audiences everywhere on February 24th. From Africa to the Americas, the landmark sites of slavery, resistance, and civil rights. For more information, check the chat box and we'll get all those links to you. If you would like to support our work at Bears Ears and other irreplaceable sites around the world, you can go to our website at wmf.org/donate or use the link in the chat. Our work is not possible without your continued support, and we are truly grateful. I invite you to discover our Heritage from Home series, which releases a new WMF virtual tour every month online. And thank you, it's going to do it for me, and I hope you all have a great day.